We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome again for those of you who maybe were a little late and didn't hear already. My name is Brooke Ruprecht. I'm a project manager at the German American Chamber of Commerce of the Midwest, actually located in our Detroit office in the Farmington Hills city, for those of you who know Michigan well. Of course, we're headquartered out of Chicago. Really excited to have you all here today for our webinar on startup and innovation, how disruption provides opportunity for innovation. And for those of you who don't know, GACC Midwest, along with our sister chambers in New York, Atlanta, and San Francisco, are the official representation of German trade in the US. And our organization is part of a global network with 140 offices in 92 countries around the world. Our webinar today on startup innovation is part of a larger government-funded initiative called our Transatlantic webinar series, Leading Through Crisis. And I just want to take a few seconds to explain what this is. Some of you who have joined before have already heard this spiel, but we're constantly tracking the COVID-19 pandemic and different business topics that arise from it. So yeah, wanted to give an overview on what we've done, where we're going, and how this project's formulated. So it's a year-long series. It's aimed at exploring topics that have been disrupted by the pandemic and discovering solutions for German and American professionals to look towards coming out of the crisis stronger together. In the last months, we've observed the impact of the digitalization on sales models due to the travel ban. We've talked about some supply chain disruption, talked about deurbanization or suburbanization in bigger cities, crisis management models such as Kurzarbeit for the Germans on the call today. I'm sure we're all very familiar with that famous German model. And today we're going to talk about startups. In the future months, we'll look at new business models during crisis, leisure activities, the acceleration of e-commerce, as well as some new business models in the healthcare and food and beverage industries. This series actually ends in January of 2022 and will accumulate into an end-of-year in-person conference in Chicago in March of 2022, where it'll be a hybrid event for those in Chicago who can join. And we'll discuss, of course, what we learned throughout the entire year and kind of following the COVID-19 pandemic, how the economy recovered and the progress that we made. This project is supported by the Transatlantic program of the Federal Republic of Germany, funded by the European Recovery Program, or ERP, of the Federal Ministry of Economics and Energy. So some housekeeping rules. I know this isn't our first webinar by any means, but if you could all mute yourselves, that helps our presenters and panelists continue the discussion a little bit less distracted. You can also share your questions in the chat function throughout. You can send it to everyone and I will address them. I really want this event today to be interactive. I think that we all kind of have a certain degree of webinar fatigue. So if you do have a question for our presenters, definitely feel free to unmute yourselves, turn your camera on. It'll be a panel-like format today. So yeah, you can just say, hey, I have a question. Can I interject? And we would love to hear from you. I think as we saw in the breakout rooms, there's a lot of perspectives on today, a lot of backgrounds, and we really want to hear from you on what you're seeing out there. You can also see speaker view if there are presentations that are shared, or excuse me, when there's presentations that are shared for the introductions, you can change that in the upper right-hand side of your screen. And then if you're having any technical difficulties, my colleague GACC Midwest is the woman behind the curtain today. If you need anything, if you can't hear, if for whatever reason something's going wrong, she can help walk you through that. And we'll hopefully get that sorted out as soon as possible. So now on to the event today. We'll observe the impacts COVID-19 has had on startups and new business creation. I've read I'm sure our speakers today will be able to speak more to this, but the US is seeing what some are calling a startup boom. In Q3, the US Census Bureau reported the highest number of new businesses created. Of course, begging me the question as why, what disruption, obviously outside of the pandemic, in what industries caused the need to innovate as of course we change the way we work, the way we live, and the way we spend our free time. So due to the nature of this topic and the excellent speakers we have today, it will be an interactive panel discussion. You will hear from 2 experts in Germany and 2 in the US speak today about what they've observed over the last year from a data perspective, from kind of an in-person on the ground perspective with innovation centers, and really experts who have devoted their lives work to this field. We'll talk about what we have seen with innovation, what industries have innovated the most, and the support available to companies during what was, for many, a very tumultuous financial time. If you are interested in this topic and would like to continue the discussion, we will have a follow-up event to this webinar. In 2 weeks, we'll do a private roundtable workshop. It is not a public event, but we would love to hear from you if this is a topic you're interested in learning more about. Participation is capped at 15 to ensure effective dialogue. So if this is something you think you want to participate in, network with other panelists on the line or speakers, excuse me, learn from each other and have a very interactive event, feel free to email me. It's just my last name at gaccmidwest.com. You can find it on our website as well, more information about that workshop. But I did want to do a little plug that we will be doing that in 2 weeks and would love to have whoever has specific insights into this topic and wants to explore it further join us. At that, I would like to extend a thank you to all of our speakers today. The first one not listed, but our colleague at GACC New York, Andrea Dywald, Director, Innovation, Investor, and Startup Relations, will speak for about 10 minutes to talk about their STEP USA program, how they help startups in Germany come to the US, and really just talk more about how they've developed that program and what it is. And then as for our panelists today, we have Amanda Elam, Research Fellow at the Diana International Research Institute at Babson College, Manas Menandru, hopefully I'm saying your last name right. He is the Chief Operating Officer at MHub, an innovation center actually in Chicago. And then Mirco Dragowski, co-head Startup Center at BBW Hochschule in Berlin. And then Tobias Skarowicz. I have a colleague who is Polish, and she advised me on your last name, and I really hope I pronounced that right. He's a board member for the company accelerator program Reactor Berlin. In the chat function, my colleague has sent a link where you'll be able to download the agenda, which has our panelist bios and their email addresses if you want to connect with them. And without further ado, I would like to hand the screen over to Andrea. So I will stop sharing, and Andrea, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Brooke, for your kind words of introduction. My name is Andrea Dywald. I work for the German American Chamber of Commerce in New York. This is my 11th year with our company. And I am the only colleague based in Hamburg, Germany, whereas the rest of my team is in New York. I myself lived in New York for more than 4 years, so I know the best of 2 worlds. And today I would like to show you what our chamber does for startups in Germany. And I'm not sure if I'm able to share my screen. Yes, seems like it. Do you see my STEP USA title page? Great.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Thank you. So STEP USA is a program that we came up with in 2014. And I'm happy to see everybody here, especially Mirco, because our paths have crossed quite a bit. So it's great to see you on this panel, Mirco. STEP USA is an abbreviation. It means Startup and Entrepreneur Program, but it's also the intention to the step you make into a new market. So that's why it's called STEP USA. And basically, it helps German companies, especially young startups, to enter the American market. It exists in 2 formats. It's a virtual program, and it also exists as a physical travel program to New York or to Boston. But we've also done visits to Silicon Valley, not the Midwest region. So maybe, Brooke, this is the start of a new idea. Who knows? STEP USA basically is bridging the gap between Germany and the US, and we help startups with US market entry knowledge, with US customer contacts, and also venture capital contacts. And this is what it basically looks like. STEP USA is made up of these different facets. We talk about location. Not every location is the right place for a startup to start. So it depends on which which industry you're in, or where your customers are. So we talk about this, of course. Then intercultural skills. I liked what somebody else said in the networking session before, that Germans and Americans working together, if it's done properly, these teams are excellent. But if they don't understand each other from a cultural point of view, you might run into problems. And one of the biggest failures in economic history probably was the Daimler-Chrysler connection at the end of the 90s that kind of broke apart. And one of the reasons was that the intercultural structures were difficult. So what we also deal with are legal and tax basics. It's somebody also said it before, when you enter the American market, you have to be incorporated there. And a lot of German companies think it's so easy to raise capital in the States. And it might be a bit easier than in Germany when it's about higher sums of money, Series B, Series C type of rounds. But of course, there are some tricks and some do's and don'ts, and that's what we teach them in the program. And we also talk about hiring American staff, not just how to hire it, but also make sure that these new hires stay on the team and that they don't run away once they have the best or they have a next good offer. And they might even take along with them some knowledge from your company. So we're looking into that as well. And as we are based right next to Wall Street in New York City, we have an in-depth network into the investor and capital scene on the American East Coast. And we help our startups really with introductions to suitable investors. And I will show some numbers later on. It's really one of the most important things to connect people and bring them together in the investor scene. And also the US customer scene. We make a lot of company introductions. And yeah, it's a very successful program, as I said. It was launched in December of 2014. We have conducted it 26 times so far. It's always like 4 or 5 days in New York City or Boston or Silicon Valley. And so far, 310 startups from all over Germany have participated. Startups, meaning at least 2 people came over. So we have more than 600 participants who have been in the physical STEP USA program. Out of these 310 startups, 64 have founded their own US subsidiary. We have a legal department in our chamber in New York, so it's very easy for us to found their LLC or Delaware Corp or whatever they need and want. That is more than 20% of our participating startups. And more than 10% of our participating startups have successfully negotiated deals with venture capitalists in the East Coast area. And we made more than 3,500 introductions to US clients. So this all sounds great, and we're really proud. But then, Corona hit us, and we could not travel anymore, obviously. So we decided to run the STEP program in the virtual format and launched it last August. We've been conducting it 5 times, and more than 100 companies from Germany have participated. It's a really nice success. And so just to get that right and hopefully not confuse you, STEP USA is basically a US market driver's license. First, you do the theoretical part, meaning the STEP USA virtual program. In your home office, it's 4 afternoons, 3 hours each. And then you do the practical part, coming to New York or Boston or wherever. We run the program, and it's 4.5 days in the respective city where we extend the network and will help you bring you in touch with the right people. So that being said, just a few impressions here. That was before COVID. As you can see, nobody's wearing a mask. That's in downtown Manhattan. That's the Freedom Tower. And we were visiting a really nice incubator there, and it was a very mild, nice afternoon. So we chose to do the session on their rooftop, which was great. We also do pitch training, and that's always a cultural thing. These 2 guys, they brought their German pitch deck, translated it into English one-on-one, and thought since it's really successful in Germany, it would do the same job in the US. But thank goodness we have Pete. Pete is one of our pitch trainers. He's an American specialist, and he helped to translate it into the right kind of language that investors want to see in New York. And if you look closely, here's the Chrysler building, one of my personal favorites. This is an investor meeting in Midtown Manhattan where we bring the group regularly. And this is the CEO. It's really cool because he explains what investors really want to see. So he lets us look behind the scenes and tells German startups what to look out for and what American investors want to see and what they are also kind of scared to do. And that's always a great session. This is a business partner matchmaking appointment in our office, one-on-one meetings, they are confidential. And we also organize a pitch night once a week, which is really cool. We have around 200 people, business angels, investors, also corporates with an interest to the startup world. And then our startups get the stage. They're 10 minutes of fame. They show the pitch that they've been working on so hard. To your left here, that's the jury, and they give valuable feedback. And first introductions are being made. And we always rent an event space in Midtown Manhattan on the 56th floor, and I just love the view. It's Broadway going down south. It's the southern part of Manhattan. The financial district is right here, Wall Street, Freedom Tower, and if you look closely, here's the Statue of Liberty. So it's a very cool feeling for our startups, to be on stage, have that view, have all these people in the room, and get going. People usually are very happy. This is a goodbye picture, and nobody was paid for smiling, so we're lucky. I guess this worked well. And I am showing you the next date. So the New York programs will start again at the end of September, hopefully, and we'll do another one in October and November. The virtual programs, the next one will be in June 28th. It's totally booked out, and in December again. Just the prices and where to register. And this is my contact information in case you would like to get in touch. And I kindly ask you, if you want to, please join me, join my network on LinkedIn or Xing or Twitter. And I very much be happy to be in touch with everybody. So thank you for your attention, and I'm open for questions if you have any.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. Maybe really quickly, also, your contact information is on GACC New York's webpage, correct? So
yes.
Okay, yeah. So we'll share the presentation as well after. But of course, if you want to get in touch with Andrea beforehand, there is online. You can find her contact information there. I do see a little bit of chat activity, which is great. Do you ever deal, Andrea, with maybe pitching the American way to German investors? Is that something that you also go the other way around, or is it focused on German investment inbound into the US?
Well, we work the other direction, from Germany to the US so far. But we have a few programs in the making right now where we are going also from the US to Germany. And yes, that's going to be one of our next steps.
Perfect. Yeah, well, I think then maybe we'll get some new follows in this round and can watch that evolution. And I think probably some questions that arise also from your presentation will translate well into the panel round. So what I would like to do is introduce the panel speakers. And then, of course, Andrea, if you have time to stick around, would love to get your insight during the panel as well. And maybe you can give your background, as I can tell, the definitely really interesting work you've done to build your program. It reminded me kind of a micro Shark Tank, if you will.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, of course. Perfect. Well, then at that, I would like to start with the introduction of our panel. I'll give 5 to 10 minutes of each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll go ahead and get into the questions. So first, I'll hand the screen to Amanda Elam. Amanda, as I already said, research fellow at Diana International Research Institute at Babson College. And without me reading your bio, I'll just let you talk about your background and what you're working on. You're still muted, actually.
There we go. Thank you, Brooke. All right, so I am a scholar of entrepreneurship and innovation at Babson College. I do a lot of research on women's entrepreneurship and collected data on COVID impacts on women founders around the world. And so I'm going to share a little bit of that data with you today. I'm also CEO and co-founder of a medical diagnostics company in North Carolina. So we have this dichotomy of people do or they teach, and I do both. Hopefully that provides some additional insights. Okay, so from an academic perspective, when we're looking at how an economic crisis impacts entrepreneurs, one of the first questions is exactly what are the nature of the shocks, right? Is it supply or demand? In the case of the pandemic, entrepreneurs faced a double shock, which meant that they were simultaneously trying to reduce risk and pursue opportunities. And the way we talk about this is a discovery-driven approach to business models. So entrepreneurs who are more opportunity-focused will often navigate survival and success in different ways, pursuing discovery and new opportunities. However, in the academic narrative and more broadly in policymaking, there is this perception that women founders somehow are only about reducing risk and surviving, whereas male founders are more likely to focus on growth and opportunity when it comes to business models. And so we thought we would go out and collect some data and see if there was any evidence to support what we suspected might be a bit of a mythology. So to put some context behind this, around the world today, according to the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, there are 252 million women starting and running new businesses. That is less than 3 years old. There are 153 million women running established businesses. So this is a sizable population. To put this in terms, that's 1 out of 3 businesses around the world are led by women. So we know this is a big population. It often gets ignored in policy making. So what are the nature of the pandemic impacts? Women were disproportionately affected in COVID. They called it a she-cession because women-owned businesses were hit harder, but it's largely just because of the industry sectors that they tend to be aggregate in, and also the lower than average business size and age. So women are more likely to be running new and small businesses. They're more likely to run businesses in hospitality, personal care, restaurants, and education and medical services. And these businesses got hit very, very hard. The other factor, of course, that really matters a lot is that in the absence of school, childcare, elder care services, women around the world tended to bear the brunt of family demands, which made it very difficult. We saw a leak out of the workforce, for example. But what did we see with business startups? So we ran 4 surveys in the spring of 2020. You can find the full results on our website at Babson College. So we surveyed about 200 founders. About 1 out of 3 were outside the US. They were less than 5 years old. They were essential services by the US designation. Most of them had less than 50 employees. 3/4 had less than $1 million in annual sales. Half of them were professional, consumer, services, wholesale, retail, and 1 out of 12 of those surveyed were VC funded. So just to give you an idea of who we talked to. And so some of the business impacts that we observed, we found about 2/3 reported a drop in revenue, whereas about 15% remained the same. We had about 1 out of 4 closed permanently, which is a lot. Remember, this is in the spring, and the closures have continued to ramp up through the end of 2020. So we know it's much worse than our initial snapshot. 1 out of 4 reduced employee hours in order to, mitigate risk. 2 out of 5 deferred or reduced executive pay. So they stopped paying themselves so they could keep their businesses going. 1 out of 3 delayed payments to vendors and loan obligations. One thing we haven't heard people talk a lot about in the news, which is how have the accounts payable cycles been impacted. But so 2 out of 4 also had enough cash to cover 3 months of payroll. these findings are consistent with the findings from many other studies on how small businesses were impacted by the pandemic, with the exception of this last statistic. This is unusually high. So women founders seem to have more cash in the bank to cover payroll for 3 months. So we thought that was interesting. In terms of risk mitigation, we also actually asked people to share words about their experience. So we had some open response questions on the survey. And one example from a survey respondent who said, our rent is unaffordable for our business model. We're always right on the edge of not being able to pay it. So it's important for us to right size and find a more affordable rent that will allow us to build savings account to help buoy through difficult times or shutdowns. So I think that women founders and many men founders as well, I'm sure, saw this as an opportunity to right size their companies. So even with the risk mitigation, we had a lot of framing around the choices they were making that suggested they saw this as an opportunity to address their business model. And we saw this reflected even more powerfully when we looked at the ways in which these businesses were pivoting. So we had over half were offering new products and services. 1 out of 3 were streaming classes or services online, and over half were marketing and promoting in a different way. You know, one participant said that as a sole proprietor, the pandemic crisis has caused me to act more boldly with my business goals. I'm going all in with my business, mainly because I have no other options. Again, this framing, right, around the narrative, we heard a lot of really optimistic silver lining. I've been meaning to market online more. I've been meaning to figure out how to introduce technologies to automate my business. I've been meaning to offer different types of products and services. So lots of evidence of business model changes and pivoting for opportunities. So key takeaways, I think that I would share with the audience is I think we have to be really careful about outdated assumptions about gender differences, right? Because what we understand in the research world is most of those gender differences have to do with the industry that the business operates in and with the size and the age of the firm. So is it the gender of the founder, or is it really just what they're doing that defines their experience? We also need to learn from women entrepreneurs and their innovations, right? They're very innovative. They're definitely pursuing opportunity in their attempts to mitigate risk and seek growth. So I think there's a bit of a false dichotomy that we see in this, you know, Mars versus Venus, men versus women language we have out there around women entrepreneurs. I also think it's really important for us to remember that any group of people is going to be full of some heterogeneity. They're not all the same. And this is very true of women founders as well. You know, 1 out of 12, 1 out of 10 were VC funded. So what was happening with those firms? And then of course, this brings us back to the concept of intersectionality, which is really gained a lot of ground in public discourse, because we aren't all just men or women. We are very complicated people with lots of lived experience, lots of different characteristics that define us in our own judgments and in the eyes of others. And then primarily, I just really want to drive home, y'all, that it's the market that really determines a lot of business outcomes. I mean, when we're as business owners, we're really focused on what we have control over, the agency aspect of it, right? So we tend not to think about the fact that it's the landscape, it's the economic environment that may be determining our outcomes. And it's actually our more effective navigation of that environment that helps us effectively start and grow amazing companies. So I'm going to leave it there with one last slide on sort of an about me. So the Diana International Research Institute is actually new. We set it up last year. It's a permanent home for an international research consortium. So we had several hundred researchers around the world focused on studying women entrepreneurs. And we have taken that conversation, that annual conference, we've created an institute, and now we're inviting stakeholders, educators, program leaders, investors, policymakers. We want them all at the table with us so that we can share what we've learned with them, and we can learn from them in order to really drive more profound thought leadership in the world of women's entrepreneurship. So we invite you to come and check it out. And we have a membership organization. It's not very expensive, but we also do a lot of programming that is free or available for small fees as well. So thank you for the opportunity to share some of this information, and I look forward to discussion.
Yes, thank you so much, Amanda. Wow, I think I've heard your presentation before, and I think a different kind of context, but really thankful to have you on today. As I had mentioned earlier, you kind of give the 30,000 feet approach of seeing, what does the data show, what's going on, and I'm really excited how I think you'll add to the discussion when we're talking with, frontline entrepreneurs or investors here today who can talk about what they're seeing out there and then what the data is showing. So thank you for your presentation. We'll get into maybe more questions in the panel round. I have some questions I have from the presentation, but I want to introduce our other panelists so we can see who else is on the line, and then we'll get going with questions. So Manas, I actually have you up next. If you'd like to share a screen introduction of your work and your panel, you can, or yourself, excuse me. If not, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Great. Yeah, I'll just talk through. So my name is Manas Mahendru. I run an organization called M-Hub Chicago, really just M-Hub. We've been around for about 4 years. We launched on the premise that there was a lot of innovation happening certainly around the country and around the world in the software side of things, but not a lot on hard tech. And we took a hard look at things. We talked to some local small medium manufacturers who shared a concern that there wasn't a lot of innovation happening to help kind of grow the industry. And so in partnership and really under leadership of small medium manufacturers, we opened up M-Hub. M-Hub allows entrepreneurs, startups, small medium manufacturers to come in and access about $5 or $6 million of tools and equipment to help startups get ready to launch companies. And so we measure success largely by typical economic numbers, jobs created, capital invested, revenue generated. And in the past 5 years, we've had, our teams, we've supported over 400 teams, over 500 teams actually. We've got about 250 right now that are being supported by M-Hub. They've raised upwards of $750 million, have generated over $400 million of revenue, created thousands of jobs. So seeing a lot of exciting activity, and certainly saw some shifts during the pandemic. I think the chaos of the pandemic, or the natural panic, is where startups thrive. That was their everyday pre-pandemic, right? Their business, the uncertainty in their business exists every day. And so that didn't really change a lot. And so you saw them, a lot of them just really kind of hit their element in a world where their daily chaos was hitting the rest of the world. And so just an exciting thing to be a part of.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to have you from Chicago. As I think we had mentioned in our breakout room, a lot of times when maybe more Germans think of innovation, they think of maybe East Coast or West Coast, Silicon Valley. So to have your expertise from Chicago, I think really adds to the discussion as well. So thank you for joining us. Really excited to have you here.
Yeah. And I'll say, one thing that's one of the more interesting things. So we've walked German delegations through dozens of times, but by far our second on web traffic, our second leading country is Germany that visits our website.
Yep. Having the hard tech and probably the manufacturing focus as well, as that's a strong industry in Germany, I think plays a big role. So perfect panelist for the topic, I think, today. So thank you for being here, Manas.
Yep.
Next, I want to introduce Mirco, the floor is yours, I guess, to introduce yourself, explain where you're coming from, what your work is, and maybe a little bit about yourself.
Yes, thank you. I'm Mirco. I'm the co-head of the Startup Center of the BBW University of Applied Sciences. We are supported by the business associations of Berlin and Brandenburg, so we're very close to the Mittelstand in this region. And we understand us as the university, the business university for the business in the region. I'm interested in many B2B business models, and we have different teams and founders in logistics or e-commerce or 3D printing, for example. I'm as well the co-chairperson of the Entrepreneurs Network of the Freie Universität Berlin Alumni Association. And last week, I met the first startup that wants to enter at first the US market, and after that entering the German market. And that was very interesting for me, but it shows that we have more mobility actually in the international startup ecosystem. And so I'm happy to learn more about the US ecosystem and the business opportunities in Chicago and in the region. And I'm happy to discuss today the COVID challenges and chances. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mirco. Yeah, great to have you here from Berlin. I guess if that's locally where you are, I know you do a lot of work in Berlin, but with the pandemic, I know it gives opportunity to move around a little bit, but great to have you from Germany and giving that perspective. Last panelist, but not least, Tobias Skarsiewicz. Am I saying your last name correct? I hope so. If you want to introduce yourself and give some background.
Nearly. I mean, you was right. It's Polish. It's Skarsiewicz, basically. But no worries. Toby is fine for basically any one of you. If you want to reach out, that makes things much easier in my case. Yeah. So my name is Toby. I'm running with my two co-founders an accelerator here in Berlin, which is called Reactor Berlin. Reactor Berlin is a, I would say, pre-seed startup accelerator. So we focus on companies which are even before foundation, working very closely with the founders and accelerating them on their way basically to a real company. So what we don't do is being an industry accelerator. So we don't focus on any specific industry, even though we have a large network of mentors from different industries, but that's basically their job. That's not what we basically do. What we basically do is doing really the ground-based work with the startups. So conducting user interviews, getting their legal documents right, getting first access to test customers with them, building up the finance round, the first angel round with the startups, even before a VC comes into game. And therefore, we right now working on a little angel fund, which is associated with this accelerator, and will grow into a VC in the next few years. So by now we on the market since about a year. 14 startups just are passing the program. 7 passed already with an incredible result of 6 of 7 startups raised funds after the program, total nearly 4 million euro for 6 startups. 1 startup made a crowdfunding campaign. So everyone get basically into the next stage. We hope to repeat this result in the next batch. Maybe let me share a few cool success stories where you could also overview the variety of the startups teams in our program. So for example, PriceLoop is a machine learning startup which helps to automate pricing for e-commerce companies. Raised from one of the most known VCs in Germany, about $1 million. It was yesterday announced. Then we had an OLED startup, Umi Hotaru, who's basically working on chemicals, OLED chemicals, inspired by the nature. Also raised a lot of capital and get a first customer as well. There's Mavuno, for example, who is analyzing satellite images in order to recognize if cashew nut trees in Africa have a disease or not. They raised a crowdfunding campaign with I think 200 large, mid-sized Tanzanian cashew nut tree farmers. So you see, like, the variety is very diverse, and I think that's also one of our USP and success factors, since it's that diverse that there's probably in our network always someone who knows someone who can help the startup, and that's basically what we learned so far. That would be it from my side. Happy for any questions and to discuss further all COVID-19 impacts on the Berlin and US ecosystem. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Toby, excuse me. Really appreciate you being here and bringing your perspective as well. I apparently, my camera was going black. My team notified me, but because now we're getting into the panel portion, if you all would like to turn on your cameras and have it be a little bit more interactive, definitely feel free to do that. You don't have to. I understand it's early in the morning or maybe late in the afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, but it'll definitely be an interactive kind of more of a discussion, especially as we're at this point very maybe webinared out. So I want it to not just be another presentation format, but instead a discussion for everybody on the line today. So first question I have for the group, and I think I want to start with Mirco actually with this question. Most existing startups face significant challenges due to the COVID-19 crisis, of course, as they're more vulnerable than other older incumbents to the shocks brought by the pandemic. They tend to engage in high-risk activities compared to other SMEs, face constraints in accessing traditional funding, and of course tend to have new developing relationships with suppliers and customers, which is what I think we've gotten from everybody today. How has your advice changed for them throughout the pandemic? What have you given maybe different advice with any of these topics that we've kind of talked about in the networking round and in the introduction?
Well, for me, it's a question of network, and it was easier to be in exchange with customers and with clients and with potential investors, but now during the pandemic, we all know the virtual events like today. And it was a challenge to build a relationship to these people. So my challenge was, and my recommendation to the startups was to look for the right contacts, for the right introductions, and it was easier during the pandemic because the people were at home, they worked at home. And it was easier to make a virtual introduction. So that changed. We've talked more about network, about contacts, and about introductions than about other challenges. So that was my part in the last month during the pandemic for our teams and founders. And I'm not sure how it's in the US or Tobias in the reactor, but it was the main challenge for us to get the right contacts now during the virtual time.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I would be very curious to know, maybe Manas, if you saw similar experience in the US. So if it was the advice you gave was just to connect, network, especially in the virtual setting, to kind of take advantage of maybe people being more open to virtual meetings. Yeah, how that looked, basically how the pandemic impacted the startup scene.
Yeah, I think, certainly there was an opportunity to connect with industry. I think that was a bit different. We facilitated a lot of that. I think we viewed ourselves as kind of a convening organization between industry and startups. And so started doing workshops, roundtables. And so we encouraged startups to come and understand how they need to pivot, where they need to focus, gather that feedback from the, frankly, organizations that were larger and needed solutions that may be different. And so our advice was lean in, communicate, listen, and adjust appropriately. But yeah, I mean, there were certainly challenges. It's tough to do when you're on an island on your own. But I tell you, large organizations were looking for startups, for innovators at that time, knowing that they've never needed it more. Just how to connect is the tough part.
Exactly. No, and I really like how you said, you know, kind of the rest of the world faced the chaos that the startups were experiencing day to day, you know? So I think that caused other people to say, oh, well, maybe what new businesses, what new ideas can we bring in to help us kind of, I don't want to say address the chaos, but get used to this new disruption, if you will. Andreas, I see you unmuted yourself. Do you want to say?
Yeah, I was wondering, it's more a question for Mirco, because we had trouble with our startups because the trust was missing. So you can make a lot of virtual introductions, you can make 100 people, but do you get anybody to invest in your product or to start a partnership virtually? We didn't see that happen. So how did you establish virtual trust?
I think it's a question of the person that makes the introduction, because I have a good experience with that for test customers, for proof of concept, and as well for investors. If I make an introduction, normally the other person is open for communication. So I have to think about it when I make an introduction, of course, but it depends, from my point of view, it depends on the person who makes the introduction. And then it works. That's my experience.
A lot of sense, but I think it's even more difficult to go across the Atlantic. So if you try to get new customers in a different country, when our startups wanted to come to the US, they had virtual introductions. We did that, but yeah, nobody gets the product over there if you've never met anybody. So I think that's, you have to shake hands, you have to meet for a beer, or to get this feeling, yeah, that the people will be on the ground and not only ship your product.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
No, you're right, but
I can help you to get. Sorry.
Yeah.
I can help you for the first step, but in the second step, you have to meet the persons on the ground, I guess.
Yes, you are right, but during COVID in Germany, we have the challenge for every company or for many startups as well, that you have the complete HR process without meeting anyone. Yes, it was starting with the video interview until the digital onboarding, and we have the same with investment rounds. There was a challenge, but it worked sometimes, that you have closed an investment without meeting the investor, only virtual meetings. But you are right, that's not the best situation.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I want to talk more about that later. You know, I think startups, or I'm sorry, innovation centers really thrived on having these communal meeting points. You know, kind of a communal working center, and of course, when that shut down, yeah, Andreas.
Another question for Mirco, sorry.
Yeah, no, please.
Or for Toby as well, because I think it's so interesting. You live in Berlin, and Berlin is one of the startup hotspots. So if you talk to your startups and they look at the US, where do they want to go? What is on their radar? What have they heard of? And where to send them?
Well, it's a chicken egg thing, I think. If they know more about the Valley and the New York ecosystem, and if they have the first contacts, for example, with the program of Andrea, then they will start on the East or West Coast. But I think that's one mission for us in Germany to make other opportunities visible, like your region. So the startups are looking for customers, they're looking for talent, and maybe New York and Silicon Valley are not the best regions for that and for the budget of these startups.
Yeah, because for me it was so interesting. We had also some startups who got a lot of investment in New Mexico, and I didn't expect that. So we had double-digit million funding for life science startups from Germany in New Mexico, and that hasn't been on my radar, I have to admit. So it was very interesting to see that there are spots out which didn't come into my mind in the first spot.
Definitely, definitely. I would be curious to know, Amanda, do you do any research on maybe the location of startup settlement, I guess, if we're talking about the topic and kind of how that's evolving, maybe in your work?
Migration patterns?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's largely urban. Nobody's going to be surprised by that. There are a few different, well, I don't know. I'm coming at it from the 30,000 foot view again, right? So are we talking about conflict economies? Are we talking about peacetime? Are we talking about, first world markets? Are we talking about emerging markets? Most of it tends to be urban. And most of it tends to be when we're looking at export businesses, when we're looking at transatlantic or expansion globally, it's all almost innovation type of drive. There are some, it's rare to find like Main Street businesses, like a Starbucks scenario, right? Where it ends up going, or McDonald's, where it goes around the world. That's really rare. It happens, but not common. We see it a lot more in consumer products. But again, it's all focused on urban. So it would be like Berlin to New York,
Definitely. And that actually brings me to my next question, with white collar migration. For those of you who maybe joined our deurbanization panel, we talked a lot about how with the work from home policy and, people having more freedom over where they live and can keep the job. Let's say they have a job in New York, but they don't want to pay for a New York apartment. Maybe they're going to rural Virginia, for example. What does that do to the innovation scene? What does that do to really the startup scene? And yeah, maybe I would go back to you, Amanda, with this question, and then I want to get some Chicago perspective too.
Well, I think that, and I'll speak a little bit too from personal experience, but some businesses, it was very easy for people to work from home. My business, it wasn't, because we run a lab and all the testing happens in the lab, and it's an infectious disease and they're pathogens. We don't want any of it out of the lab, right? And I did look at what Monis is doing at MHub too. I mean, prototyping, it has to happen in person. So I think a lot of that activity became much more difficult, became much harder. We had 2 people in my company where their positions could be done from home. And so they did prefer to work from home, marketing, and some administration. From a larger work from home pattern, I guess I'm old enough now that I feel like the pendulum will swing back the other way. We're already starting to see some large companies put mandates, for people to come back in. I expect all of the incubators, accelerators will trail what the big companies are doing.
For sure, Manis, maybe can you speak about the need to have in-person still work, what that does to your labor force, what you're seeing in Chicago, things like that?
Yeah, so there's a few different perspectives here. So I echo what Amanda said. At MHub, and I think this is a benefit for us, certainly. If you want to prototype, you need to be there in person. I think for the most part, in innovation centers, even pre-pandemic, the magic happens in those casual interactions throughout the space. I tell people when they walk through the space, they come for the equipment because you walk around, you belong there. It's like a playground for a typical engineer to have that much equipment, but they stay for the community, right? Because there's people around them that are having challenges that they're having or have had challenges they're having. They learn from that and they hopefully succeed from the programming and the mentorship and all of that. So being in person will create those opportunities. There's ways to do it digitally, and we're facilitating that and at a higher degree than we used to. But I know like our software kind of incubators, peer organizations to this day are empty. We average probably about 120 people on site a day now, less than what it used to be, but it's starting to come back up. And I think industries, I tend to just think more people are going to come back than I think people are predicting. I think that there'll be some degree of hybrid, but I think there's a different interaction. I think a different magic happens when you can interact. And I think there's, like you've mentioned a few times, there's a fatigue that is setting in, from all these video calls and other things. When you start seeing people in person, it makes a difference. And that's where some creativity kind of comes up.
Sure. Which is, such a vital ingredient for startups, of course. So to lose that kind of space for collaboration could be, in some areas, detrimental to the success of the business. So I would like to get some German perspective in Berlin, white collar migration. I know also there's different cities that are becoming hubs, such as Frankfurt and Munich. Tobias, I'll start with you. What are you seeing in Germany? How did the pandemic maybe shape innovation hubs that used to be Berlin and now are spreading a little bit? And what is it like going back into the office, having collaborative spaces?
First of all, I totally agree to what Mana said. I mean, that's this cohesional meetings of people. They're so important if you run a early stage accelerator or a hardware space. But I would try to divide like 3 different perspectives on that topic. Like since last year, I still was on the VC side of table. So that basically, and the second perspective, like from startups, maybe from our startups, and as a facilitator, as an accelerator or another hub. So like from VC perspective, I basically think you could do like the pandemic gave us the opportunity to do even more, to source more deals, to screen more deals, to review more deals, to get more data on the these startups in a much shorter time. So that was I think that effect was even very positive, because you get like more. I had the feeling to get more knowledge and a much better overview. Yeah, the personal part, like building this trust, of course, this was shortened up. But once once you did it in a very effective way, because you could focus only on that part and not anymore on getting information, on gathering information on that deals. So I personally really enjoyed that. That kind of change, especially because like the negotiation part. I was working for an early stage VC. Maybe later stage is something different, but for an early stage VC, the negotiation was even more equal. You don't have this guy coming in the suit, demonstrating his power, and then negotiating the deal with a young founder, first-time founder, who doesn't have the courage. Let me go to the startup perspective. Like for the startup perspective, that was. I mean, like in our case, most of our startups don't have a team yet. Yeah, they just 2 co-founders, and they, regardless of the pandemic, they will meet anyways. Or somewhere they go into a park, or they go, they meet at home and work together. They will meet anyways. 2 of them. Regarding the team, it's a bit harder to build a team, of course, when you can't really meet the person, especially at this early stages. That's really difficult, because you can't build up the trust. And this networking effects, and that's where I jump into the facilitator or accelerator role. So what we were used to do, like for decades, is like doing events, networking occasions, pitches, where we're building platforms where people can occasionally meet. And that whole pandemic situation brought us into using videos, trying to get the same feeling online, which not always felt the same like before. So that was basically hard. But what basically happens is that you don't. So we stopped this basically spraying and praying and like doing events, and then hopefully something will work out. We started to work more on the point and more effectively with the startup together, and that's where we basically learned as an accelerator, because we tried to focus our job on a very concrete problem of the startup, and then introduce someone who we think really matched that problem, instead of spraying and praying, basically, and that's I think a good thing.
Definitely. And I think that there's, as all the speakers said, lots of pros and cons. So you bring up an interesting point. A lot of times if it's just two people in a company, I mean, especially if they know where the other one's been, maybe they are still meeting in person. They don't need that office space. But I think it also depends on the business model, right? If there is prototyping happening, if they do need office space, I've been at incubators or accelerators and toured them, and I've just been always so impressed by the level of kind of collaborative spaces they have ingrained in it. And that was something that was so interesting to me when the pandemic hit, is what are all these spaces being used for now, but I guess that's a new point, like you had mentioned, there's different video options, there's different ways to kind of have the digital space for collaboration, if you will, popping up. So interesting to see how that kind of pivoted a little bit. One thing I also want to touch on, and I'm also keeping an eye on the time, we're doing fine, but quite a lot of topics I want to get through today. I read an article, Manas, for the state of Illinois granting $2.78 million to rebuild Illinois' economy post-COVID-19 to innovation hubs, and one of which being mHub. Would you be able to speak a little bit about kind of the level of funding you've received and where you're directing that funding, what the effort is going to, and where you guys are kind of focusing in on now when rebuilding the economy?
Yeah. So just one quick correction. It wasn't from the state, it was from the federal government. It was the Economic Development Administration. And so, we created a partnership with 1871 and Matter, two large organizations that work very similar to us. Matter's focusing on healthcare, digital healthcare. 1871, really a digital focused innovation center to kind of say, look, we're at our core job creators. And so I think around April of last year, we met and just said, the economic hit here is going to be massive, and we need to start being proactive about what the recovery is going to look like and what that world is going to be, and then how we get some momentum kind of going into that. And so our proposal to the EDA really focused in on taking this opportunity to be inclusive in our growth. Some of the things that we learned was, historically we've been accessible to certain communities. Going virtual allowed us to be accessible to a lot more. And they created good connections. And so if we are able to build out more curriculum that's available online, if we'll be able to further create networks that are available online, right? So connecting people to mentors, connecting people to resources, that's helpful. One things that we do for our membership community is things like, so I mentioned before, small, medium manufacturers said they need support in innovating. Every entrepreneur that comes into our space, and we've got over 500 members, there's about 250 companies, there's over 500 members, have unique skill sets, right? They may be electrical engineering, maybe computer, maybe software. We have all that data. And so when a small, medium business comes to us with like, hey, here's a problem statement, we need help here, we contract with entrepreneurs to say, hey, you need a little extra funding for your business. Here's a quick $30,000, work on this project. Small, medium business gets all the IP and all of that, but it kind of helps both sides. And so we're just taking that a step further with this grant to support connecting ecosystems and connecting resources virtually to help us kind of power through and see our way through this change. Mm-hmm. And so, the Economic Development Administration has been a tremendous supporter of EMA in particular over the last few years, and has supported every single one of our programs we've ever done. Mm-hmm. And we're excited for this new one.
Definitely. I think it's a very big testament to the importance of your work and the continuation of the work that is happening in the innovation space. I would be curious to know, if similar programs have happened in Germany, maybe Mirco, you can speak to the level of either local, state, or federal support that have arisen in the pandemic for startup or for innovation centers, particularly, if you have that information.
Yes. Well, at the beginning of the pandemic in February, March last year, we had the risk that that we have no new venture capital deals, because the VCs were focused to their portfolio startups. If they need help, if they will, maybe Toby can add something because he has VC experience in the last year, for example. But that was a challenge. And then the ecosystem, the association discussed with the government, and the solution should be, or one element of the solution, to have a matching fund tool so that you can support the venture capital funds with a matching, I think, Toby, 70 to 30% in relation, max 50-50, so that they are able to focus to their portfolio startups and to make new deals, for example. That was the venture capital focused startup tool. And then we had, I think, tools like loans for other startups that are not VC backed. But what we are not had was it's a very good idea to have grants for projects between the old and the new economy. That's a very great idea. But Toby, could you add something about the tools of the government in the last year?
I mean, I would maybe just add, since like we have this federal system in Germany, and there was also on the federal level, especially in Berlin, on the level of Berlin, the public bank of Berlin basically also initiated such a matching fund for business angels, local business angels, where also a lot of business angels associated in our network participated in order to basically bridge the uncertainty gap of COVID, which at the end was there's still a lot of money being invested in this year, and one main reason might be this matching facilities.
Yeah, one thing I will say, so I mean, the grant that we just got has been in the works for almost a year. It was part of the first COVID bill. When we announced a couple weeks ago, Senator Dick Durbin came to MHub to make also just a pitch for a bill that he was proposing on Senate floor that actually passed 2 days ago. So the US government just allocated in a bipartisan way $250 billion to support manufacturing. And it was out of the pains and the concerns that came from the pandemic and the inaccessibility of the chips and the problem that presents, and investment into medical research and things like that. So I think that there's more to come, and I don't know that I fully understand exactly how that's going to be allocated. And it's my job to figure it out here in the next month or so. But I'd imagine, Amanda, if you've seen this, there's a lot more funding coming, and I think that people are trying to figure out how government needs to play a role.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I was gonna say, in life sciences, there was a really interesting, if not surprising, phenomenon that occurred during the pandemic. All of the NIH funding, every channel, every call for every opportunity solicitation that went out, the review channels were flooded with COVID-19 proposals, and they all got funded instead of, because they're restricted funding pools, instead of the usual, right? So there were institutes and research fundings whose survival was at risk. There were all sorts of new discoveries and innovations where all the research got frozen. So when we look at the movement of money, I think it's really important. I mean, Mirco talked about at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this perception that investors were all going to double down on their portfolio companies. The data suggests they didn't even do that. They just stopped everything, right? And so the least supportive in our data, the least supportive, the poorest sources of support is a better way to phrase it, were investors and vendors. And we saw the same thing, supply chain. People talk about supply chain delays, but the price gouging and opportunism we saw in the supply chain was wicked as well. And small companies, again, are very vulnerable to this. We needed to buy a new PCR machine, and ours failed, or one of ours failed. And we went to the vendor who sold us the last one. They wanted to charge us 3 times the amount they sold last time. Why? Because demand was high because of COVID. And so they could. And I mean, so we've had some interesting conversations with vendors around, operating in bad faith and poor, poor customer service and all of this stuff. But I will say that as someone who experienced it, it was hell. At the same time, historically, small business has never played an important role in policymaking around economic crises. Usually the small businesses just absorb it. This is the first time in my career and my life I've seen so much attention to how do we protect the new and small businesses in our economy from the government response standpoint. That's been phenomenal. And this is part of the trend that seems to be ongoing, Manas, is policymakers are really starting to think about our economy in a more heterogeneous way. And I think it could be significantly to the benefit of the types of companies that you're working with and that you serve.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we look back, certainly when I look back 5 years from now, I've got a feeling that's going to be the fundamental shift. I know that I sit in rooms and, being the innovator, I try to get people to think differently, but, we talk about the importance of farming and the government heavily subsidizes it in ways that we don't necessarily for other industries. And there needs to be a look of how critical some of these infrastructures and these research things are to be more deliberate about it and then engage different parts of the economy to make sure it works. But yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting few years as we follow through, but somewhat unpredictable. And I mean, it's interesting. We expected the same thing for investors to double down on their existing investments. Didn't quite see them. I can't rationalize it.
Because the market disappeared. Why would you double down on your investment if the market's gone? Right?
So there was no opportunity to invest in new investments because investors want to meet you before they invest in something. So they're not going to invest in new funds who've never done this in a time of crisis. They're going to go with the people that they trust and have worked with. But it seems like everything just kind of came to a halt. It definitely is like, let's wait this out. And then 2 months turned into 6 months, turned into a year. And at that point, it's like, now we got to figure this out. And then it's where's everybody running away from and why?
Right. We saw the same thing with the funding, though, that we saw in the research and in the government funded research, NIH funding. In the investment world, we saw all these investors go, it was a gold rush, right? Oh, COVID, it must be important. And from an infectious disease perspective, we're like, this isn't going to last long, you guys. Like 2 years, maybe. It's just going to be till we get the vaccines out there. And I know a lot of people died, and I'm not disrespecting that, but the percentage was really low. It was the high infectious nature of the virus that was really of the concern, because we lose a lot of people to flu every year. And nobody thinks twice about that. No one even takes the damn flu vaccine very seriously. Here we've had a pandemic where people understand. Enough people are affected, even with a really tiny impact rate, more mortality rate. A lot of people can die. So everyone's rushing to vaccines, they're rushing to diagnostics, they're rushing to all of these things. And it's just like, oh my God, like innovation pipeline stalled. Nothing's going anywhere.
Yeah, I would like to add, so there was also a lot of money rushing into Germany. So I proposed 2 billion for the startup scene. Even on our state level, we had, I think, 50 million for our startup hubs, and everybody who had an idea on COVID got between 1 and 25 million easily, which has never happened before. So everything, it's looking right, like COVID treatment or help or anything got so much funding. So they will change their business models in the future, but money wasn't the problem. But it wasn't private investors, but it was government money and state level money, which flows freely in Germany at the moment, I would say.
Yep.
I would also like to go a little back to the supply chain disruption, because I think this is, I mean, in Germany we had a lot of programs focused on investment side, but financial help in order to bridge the disruption of the supply chains. I mean, that's massive issues. Like what I heard yesterday is a container from Asia to Germany with whatever goods raised in price about 10x. Last year was 800 euros. Right now, a container costs 8,000 euros in order to ship something. Or one of our startups, they're doing a cargo biking sharing model, which is ordering cargo bikes from all over the world. They're having tremendous problems in getting bike parts, like brakes, for example. The earliest delivery date is in 2 years or something, and that's a super growth business model. It's impossible to get the brakes in 2 years for them. So this is I mean, there will be massive effects coming from this disruption of supply chains. I think.
Tobias, I don't think that policymakers have even begun to get their heads around the supply chain issues. You know, what we in the US, we did some special financing focused on food and restaurant industry, and nobody, the policymakers hadn't thought. I participated in a US chamber webinar about this, and basically there were people saying, we're not a restaurant or a caterer, but we supply the food. We're the baker that sells the baked goods to the retail outlet. Do we qualify? And the answer was no. So there were all these exclusions for, so yeah, you're helping these restaurants, but their vendors are struggling and may not survive. Or, I mean, it was bonkers. It was really bonkers. And of course, with policy, you have to put boundaries around it. There isn't necessarily money for everybody. We also saw examples of, I mean, even in you know, health services, like dentists shut down for 3 months in the U.S. And I know one practice where they just shut down and everybody went on unemployment because most of the people in the dental practice made more on unemployment than they did working as a dental assistant or administrator. And so, I mean, I'm thinking about, you know, when we get all this data on the businesses that have started and the businesses that have closed, you know, what are the stories going to be that come out of this? Like, what were the patterns?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, so, I mean, certainly part of our grant that we just got in partnership with Matter in 1871, looking at supply chain and addressing some concerns there is a part of it. And I think that is, again, I haven't looked too far into it because we're 2 days removed, but the $250 billion spending bill, I think, is primarily focusing on supply chains, but there is a scope. And so I don't know what those lines are.
One thing I would want to know is maybe what industry saw the highest level of investment. So I know, Andreas, you mentioned that if there was a COVID business model in Germany, you know, you of course saw a lot of investment. Is this similar in the US? Andreas, do you want to maybe share a little bit more of that? Go ahead.
Not too much in the US. I've just seen it in Germany that every COVID-related topic or lifestyle and health issue got 2 million funding and more, up to 25 million in our state. Normally it's been 500,000 for a good idea before, but yeah, the level just increased dramatically. And it's also shifted the focus of the companies. Now they are more focused on the state. So they hope to get the next funding from the state or from the government. They're not looking at private investors anymore. So that's always, yeah.
I shared a link in the chat because there's some research going on around how digital tools helped companies survive the pandemic. And it turns out the companies with more small, and they were looking new and small still, but the companies that had more automation, more cloud-based, more digitization, just generally had a significant competitive, they were much less likely to lose money. And I think that's really important when you think about where the investors were spending money. Some were certainly, a lot of people were going after COVID, right? But a ton of money was going after software and anything that could help companies sell online, sell better online.
Makes sense.
Yeah, maybe Mirco, haven't heard from you in a minute. Do you have any insight into maybe what industries you saw in Germany really took off? I know here in the US, fintech is in the news over and over and over again. Maybe what you saw in Germany with like just emerging new business models and ideas.
if I talk about industries, I see many new startups in the digital health sector, and another interesting sector is the life science or biotechnology sector, because in the past we didn't had a real ecosystem for life science and biotech startups. Well, we have the German Accelerator in Boston, for example, and in Hanover and in other regions, Heilbronn, we have a good life science, small good life science ecosystem in Munich. But during the pandemic, and if you look at companies like CureVac and BioNTech, we have more and more awareness in the political ecosystem that we need more and more support for biotech and life science startups. And I think that is a new important industry in Germany, and we will see more and more startups growing up. But actually, I see many new startups in the digital health sector and social impact startups, of course.
Yeah, lots of platforms, event planning, teledoc services.
Also seen a lot of successful startups from Berlin in the e-commerce space. So everything which could open up you an e-commerce shop to your normal shop, they also raised a lot of money and were pretty successful on the short and long run, I think.
And the communication platforms, I think Zoom's doing okay.
Well, they're certainly easier to use than WebEx.
Yeah.
Exactly, right. We're on their platform right now, so.
Right. Yeah.
We have
On
Germany.
digital trade shows.
Maybe
one which was not that great.
A very prominent example in Germany is probably the most prominent right now is probably Gorillas, our German copycat of GoPuff from the US, which raised, I don't know, $1 billion during pandemic times. It's enormous, and they do a finance rounds every 2 months, I think. Incredible cash burn, and it's insane. I would even say. Just opened last 2 weeks an office in New York right now. So Gorillas is, I think, the most prominent example of a pandemic, of a startup winning basically the pandemic. I'm not sure if you can say that the pandemic is really the reason why this startup took so high off the ground, or if it's just the model. So they basically do emergency shopping within a few minutes. So you can order a 6-pack of beer or a donut or some fruits and get delivered it by bikers in 5 minutes or something wherever you live. And they scaling massively right now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely, the pandemic is probably one reason for that, but I think also the naive child dream of calling someone getting groceries at home is also a big factor for this success. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, I think it's definitely interesting to understand, while the COVID-19 definitely changed a lot with startups, at the same time, as Manas already said, startups kind of already thrived in this platform, or this idea of chaos disruption. That's really where new ideas were born. So if anything, it kind of shifted their outside, small businesses or established businesses into looking at new ways to support the disruption they were feeling. What I would love to do, looking at the time and having, about 5 minutes left, I'd like to give kind of closing remarks from each speaker. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges when getting your business established, from networking to funding to, getting off the ground and running, having your idea picked up. Maybe in a couple minutes, if maybe I'll start with you, Amanda, what some words you would suggest for really innovators out there, entrepreneurs, really developing a business idea with your experience with your own startup, as well as a research fellow. Maybe what's some advice that you have for them?
Yeah, I think my advice, there are pros and cons to starting a business in a pandemic. And so I started my company in the last recession, and you know, and so I think that's, we're always navigating a landscape. That's what I'm really gonna focus on, is that your ability to successfully start and grow a business has everything to do with what's going on around you, and it's learning how to effectively navigate that and mobilize the resources, find the people, get the intel that you need in order to pull it all together.
And it's never, I guess, the perfect time to start a business, but also never a bad time. So, I mean, depending, I guess, on how you look of things, but I guess pros and cons, like you said. So, yeah, really interesting to hear from you. Like I said on the agenda, if you would like to connect with Amanda, her email address is in that agenda form that my colleague Elena sent out. So feel free to download that. Manas, next for you, I would love to hear your insights as an innovation center, specifically with the industries you work for. What's your advice? What have you seen out there, given the last year and a half that companies have struggled, you know, when starting a new business, when innovating, when trying to get things off the ground and running?
Yeah, so I think it's, I mean, there's a handful of things and it varies dramatically. And I think there's a cultural component to this. I mean, I'll be one to kind of drive in the entrepreneurs to say, let's not overthink this, like just create some action, just go, like create a financial model. Don't just focus in on the product. Get that voice of customer. There's some pretty standard things that are very easy to overthink. But when you're thinking about it, just go through the motions that are productive. Lean into that. And I think being part of communities and getting out there is important. You know, getting out of your own silo is pretty critical. So yeah, that's my biggest source of advice, is don't overthink it, lean in, give it a try. And it's relatively low risk for a short period of time. Usually if you fail, like, you'll learn a lot in the process and it'll position you for the next one. The other thing is actually also don't overestimate kind of today and tomorrow for 5 years from now. Think forward. So I think that, you know, what Amanda was saying, where a lot of people are rushing into those investments. By the time, if you're just getting started now, it's too late. Think through what the next implication is. Be thoughtful, have a position, and go.
Perfect. Yeah. And of course, for any new businesses in your region that want to get started, you have your contact information as well. So you can have further discussions with you to kind of talk through all those first steps when incorporating and getting going. Mirco, maybe I'd hand it over to you in Germany and Berlin, what you usually help German companies looking to start up in Berlin, and then also maybe looking to come into the US. What's some advice you give to them?
My advice is build a strong network, make contacts when you don't need them, and think about tools like advisory boards. You can have an advisory board with researchers. You can have an advisory board when you enter new markets. You can have an advisory board if you are in a regulated sector with politicians. So build a strong network. That would be my advice. And the network will help you if it's strong enough in every time. During a pandemic, post-pandemic, I think network is a very relevant point for everybody, and for startups, it's very important.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Toby, I'm so sorry, I keep saying Tobias, I read your name. Toby, maybe some last advice from you with kind of the very, very intro stages when you deal with your startup companies.
I think everything was said so far. So let me just add, be kind and try to help others. I think the pandemic had also with all the digitization and all the communication from far away, also some negative aspects into interpersonal relationships, more hate, more etc. on the internet. So just this, don't get influenced by that. Just try to be kind and help others as much as you can. Then probably you'll get help as well. That would be it from my side.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. At that, we're just about out of time. So I just want to send one big, huge thank you to our panelists today, also our attendees. I was very intrigued and, of course, really happy to hear read all of the comments on the chat function. Very interactive group. This webinar was being recorded, so we will send the recording to all of the RSVPs. So for those who couldn't make it today, they'll be able to hear the comments and also get in touch with any of our panelists if they have questions and want to reach out. And then one last plug, we do have a workshop in a couple of weeks. Again, if you like the discussion today, if you want to continue it on, if you have a specific startup or a business that you want to have, I guess, a couple hours of a little bit more interactive, ask questions, smaller setting, definitely feel free to write me an email. Say you want to be involved. We still have open spots, but participation is limited. So don't miss out on that. Next month, we will also talk about new business models in the pandemic with leisure. So what did sporting events look like? How did companies shift their technologies? How are people spending their free time differently? Really excited to have some great speakers on that panel and that discussion. So that'll be on June 8th. If you are free and available and would like to join for that next installment of our Transatlantic webinar series, Leading Through Crises. So without anything further, just again, one last quick thank you to everybody, our panelists, our attendees. If you have any questions, need anything else, feel free to get in touch with me, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks,
a lot.
everybody.
Bye.
Enjoy.
Thank you.